everyone. I am so glad you're here. This is the 2019 Instruction Section Annual Virtual Discussion Forum. I am Lauren Hayes and I chair the Discussion Group Steering Committee. And I'm very excited to have our panelists joining us today. I think we're in for a really interesting time, and I think we'll learn a lot from the panelists. The title of our presentation today is Challenging Deficit Thinking in Academic Libraries, Ideas and Applications. And so I will turn it over to the panelists who will introduce themselves.
Yeah, so hello everybody. My name is Eamonn Tool. I am the Head of Research Support and Outreach at Columbia University's Science, Engineering, and Social Science Libraries. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm very excited to be speaking with you all today. So I'll turn it over to the rest of our panelists for introductions.
Hi everyone, my name is Rosanna Mottola. I'm an outreach librarian at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm excited to join you today.
Hello, my name is Eating. I'm the online design librarian at California State University in Northridge. I'm also the coordinator for Affordable Learning Solutions here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also excited to join you.
My name is Chelsea Heinbach. I'm a teaching and learning librarian at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm also very excited to be here.
My name is Amy Pajewski. I'm the Student Success Librarian at Westchester University Libraries, and my pronouns are also she, her, hers, and I'm excited to be here as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So thanks again, everyone, for attending today. It's great to have you all be here. We're really pleased that the topic has resonated with folks, and we're excited to share our work on a topic that we feel passionately about. So thank you especially to Lauren Hayes and Melissa Harden and the rest of the committee members who really literally made today's forum happen. And we'll have time for Q&A after discussing a few questions that I'll pose to our panelists. And we encourage you to submit those questions in the chat box, as well as you can tweet from the session or pose your questions for us on Twitter using a hashtag InfoLit, not deficit. So there you have it. So I wanted to start off with just a little bit of an introduction on deficit thinking and how we're approaching this topic. So just a bit of background and then we'll get into our discussion. So deficit thinking, many of you may have heard about through educational research and theory, but it's a term that covers different ideas that are based in some way on a person lacking something. So that can mean linguistic difference, it can mean cultural difference, or it can mean difference in terms of literacies, right? So in this way of thinking, there's always a deficiency that needs to be remedied, right? So it operates with the idea that a given population has a state of need, right? And the best way to address this is for people to apply themselves or try harder or conform or things like that, right? So in education specifically, deficit thinking views students as lacking something as opposed to already having, coming to a classroom with important experiences and knowledge to contribute and build upon, right? And I think of certain groups who are pathologized in higher education and kind of viewed as liabilities in terms of retention. So that means first generation students, international students, transfer students, pretty much anyone who doesn't fit that traditional, again, quote, student category. So that idea of a non-traditional student comes with a bundle of kind of problematic assumptions and positions students who don't meet this kind of culturally specific set of criteria, like speaking English or being within a certain age range, having a job outside of classes, as kind of being outside of the norm, right? So the problem as we see it is that this leaves large numbers of students who really need support feeling like they're an exception to the rule, like they don't belong on campus or in libraries, and like they're a problem that needs to be fixed, right? So we'll begin this discussion kind of with that assumption that as teaching librarians, we need to be open to broader ways of engaging with our students and finding ways to value their different contributions and strengths. And so we'll start out with identifying kind of where and how deficit thinking takes place, and then spend the bulk of our time today on identifying alternatives and examples of how it's been done in our different settings. So to kick it off, wanted to ask you all, one, what is deficit thinking, in libraries especially, and how does it occur in library instruction and information literacy? How do you see that kind of playing out in your settings?
Hi, Eamon. Thanks for asking that question. Just to give a little background on my context, I'm the coordinator of information literacy instruction at my institution and also run a community of practice of other teaching librarians too. So I think deficit thinking often comes, at least in the librarian instructor perspective, that librarians as teachers and teachers generally are often attempting to, like you said, fix problems with students rather than mitigating their own bias and prejudice among themselves, among the other teachers at their institution. So if we can start to understand how teachers' expectancies influence student achievement, what are our expectancies as instruction librarians of students and their outcomes, we can start to consider ways to ameliorate the ways that teachers' expectations can otherwise be confounded with students' cultural backgrounds. So if we're able to kind of look inward and see, what's going on with us and how those biases are affecting our experiences and our expectations and interactions, we can start to understand our students a little bit better. I think right now we're not really fully invested in understanding the historical context of and historically marginalized students because a lot of the times we don't have that required education or pedagogy background, right, that a lot of other faculty or teachers in K through 12 have and that they're getting. So I think right now we don't really have that required education as part of our LIS programs. And so what we need to do is really start developing a critical awareness as one way to really focus on this issue. And that could be through mentorship or some sort of teaching and learning focused community of practice.
Yeah, I like that idea of strengthening our knowledge as teachers, right? To get to better know these pedagogies to implement and try out, right? Great, thank you. Yeah.
And I totally agree with what Amy just said, the connection between the education field and librarianship. And here at Northridge, so I see we as librarian actually hold faculty status. So I was very fortunate and grateful to have received a lot of trainings with faculty development. And that made me aware of the fact that the way that we interact with students only through those one-shot sessions can be really limiting for us to understand their background. As Amy said, there's a lot of their where they come from, of their struggles, and that we weren't able to understand that better because of the one-shot nature of our instructor sessions. So I do think understanding the why of this issue is really important for us to make ourselves more available in different opportunities to interact with students to understand their backgrounds and to really work more with other educators, other stakeholders at our institution.
I was wondering how long it was going to take us to mention the one shot as a limitation that we face. So thank you for doing that early on.
Okay, so can everyone hear me a little bit better now? Awesome, okay. I'm like, I did two things, hopefully one of them worked. Awesome, thanks for letting me know, sorry about that. So yeah, I agree with everything that you all just talked about. Like the rest of higher ed, I think academic libraries are kind of scrambling to acknowledge and respond to our diversifying student populations, our first generation students, and the increased likelihood that students will transfer between schools during their education. And like you all mentioned, our mission to teach information literacy is really overwhelming. So we often don't have that much opportunity to kind of envision our students as complex beings because we have 50 to 75 minutes with them through their entire session. And if we aren't careful, sometimes I think our frustration with the limitations of what we're able to do in that time can kind of turn into frustration with students for not knowing more. I also think it's natural to kind of recognize places where you might be able to help, but I think where this framing becomes unintentionally harmful is if it becomes the only story that you're telling yourself or your colleagues about a particular group of students. Additionally, I think one of the most significant reasons that deficit thinking happens in library classrooms is that the majority of librarians are a part of the dominant racial culture in the United States. So more specifically, 87% of librarians are white. And because many of us are part of that dominant racial culture, we can't really step outside of the expectations, the assumptions, and the biases that kind of come with that unless we do a lot of internal work in a really intentional way. So without doing that work, we're going to bring all of those inaccurate and harmful assumptions to the classroom. So we're trying to work and figure out how our institutions can transform for the better because of our students instead of quote unquote focusing on fixing them.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's lots of great points made. And I'm already thinking about ways that we can kind of shape those different approaches to teaching and other models that exist, either that you all have tried in your instruction or teaching or work with other librarians or otherwise. Anything that's worked for you all?
For me personally, since I'm a fairly new librarian, what I benefit a lot is from like reading some of the new literature in culturally responsive teaching and attending workshops on them at my institution. And I think most of us kind of know intuitively how to do that. That is really like the framework that really spells out different strategies that we can think of when we design a lesson or when we come into classrooms. For culturally responsive teaching, I believe many of you have heard of it already. So it basically talks about how to engage all learners in like a multicultural classroom. And for me, because I originally come from China, which has a very different educational system, that may result in international students from China being unclear about some of the expectations of the Western academic setting. So within the culturally responsive teaching, I noticed what's really helpful is to emphasize there are different ways to engage students. So for students who might not speak English as the first language, it's important to emphasize that there are different ways that they can be expressing their ideas, and to really have different ways to present, to show that they have learned certain knowledge in classroom. And it's very relevant actually to another very popular framework nowadays, which is Universal Design for Learning. And it's really an educational framework that based on research in the learning sciences, and that goes beyond accessibility. So what accessibility usually talks about is how do we kind of accommodate students with various abilities, and that can be kind of in the deficit thinking mode, because we may think more about how we're going to accommodate them, how are we going to accommodate the different, how are we going to address their deficit knowledge, or why they're different from what we require them to do. But for Universal Design for Learning, we're really thinking about how we can design a curriculum, or we can provide an education that thinks about different learners in mind. So just give the quick example. So my role as the only instructional design librarian to create modules, including videos for our students, I usually have like different ways for them to engage with the content. For example, they're definitely going to be captioning for the videos. It's not just for students with visual impairment. It's actually for students who may prefer to actually read, to have like those textual information, or for students who might not want to listen to the voice right now, who may want to skim the content. So it's really thinking about all students instead of just one particular population. I think that's really the key for universal design for learning, and that's also how why I think it's important to bear in mind when we try to find an alternative model for deficit thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that culturally responsive teaching especially is a really, that's something that's resonated with me as a way to think about, how do you respond to different cultures represented in a classroom. And as Emily Dravinsky pointed out in the chat box, part of this too is about the conditions of a classroom that we're experiencing, right? So there's limitations on time, maybe we're stressed out running from one place to another. And as Chelsea mentioned too, that just plays out in a classroom in oftentimes a negative way. So thinking about ways to address that as well is important, right? Other thoughts on models and ideas for moving past deficit thinking?
Yeah, so there's so many pedagogical approaches that work against the deficit mindset. There's asset-based pedagogy, funds of knowledge, culturally responsive teaching, like you brought up, critical pedagogy. And I like to kind of pull from all of these to inspire and inform my thinking and my teaching. So for example, critical pedagogy inspires me to decenter the scholarly peer-reviewed source as the most important or trustworthy kind of information. And so I'll complicate this narrative by talking about this journal, the Journal of Political Philosophy. And in 2017, they published a Black Lives Matter themed issue that had not a single Black author. So it's really an opportunity to kind of discuss gatekeeping in academia and how that limits the perspectives that are available in academic work. Meanwhile, I am inspired by funds of knowledge approach when I think about asking students to connect their previous knowledge and experiences to their research question. So for example, I work with a first-year seminar class that asks the students to research a challenge that first-year students face. So it's first-year students researching challenges that first-year students face. So it's like this really beautiful way of asking them to reflect on the challenges that they're going through, things that have helped, and I'll ask them to do that at the beginning of class. Like they'll have 5 minutes to free write to think about the things that they've gone through in their first couple of months or in their first year, what's helped them overcome them. And then I'll lead them through an activity that connects those to like community concerns. So what, maybe this is happening to you personally, like what kind of community do you belong to that also is facing this challenge? And then connecting that to systemic issues. And so that leads them to a research question that they have personal experiences and knowledge that they can draw from. And one last example I'll pull from is open pedagogy. So it gives us so much opportunity to acknowledge students as contributors and creators. And it's inspired me in really big ways. Like we've created opportunities for students to edit Wikipedia through assignments and Wikipedia edit-a-thons. But it's also changed smaller things that I've done. So like a different first-year seminar that I work with in engineering, I'll have the students create kind of like an evaluation technique as a community. So they're creating the techniques, the things that they want to check, all of this stuff to evaluate information. And then they use that, and they create it with such little guidance for me. Like it's their criteria, it's what matters to them. And they use that to evaluate the information that they're finding for their projects. So it's kind of like, this is the stuff that you already know, you're doing this all the time anyway. How can you frame that for an academic project?
Yeah, that's great, thank you. Any other thoughts from Amy or Rosanna?
So I think a lot of the things that everybody else brought up about challenging deficit thinking are also stuff that we do or are trying to do at my institution. I think one way to take these different pedagogical approaches is actually being able to mentor incoming librarians as well as the ones that are already here. So what I did in, this past year was kind of start a community of practice mentoring approach with our teaching librarians. So I know a lot of places do this already where you're integrating lesson plans and these are our learning objectives and that sort of thing. But the idea of the community of practice is that people volunteer to come to the group. And what we do is we have this big open forum where there's readings ahead of time. We bring in speakers to come speak to us. So that could be people from across campus, administrators, other faculty, to come talk to us about their pedagogical approaches. And most recently, that's been more of that culturally responsive teaching that Yi and Chelsea were talking about. So something that we really focus on is the asset-based and critical awareness. So that idea of critical pedagogy and getting those approaches really integrated into our teaching. So we can hear about these things all the time, but like, how do you actually translate that into the classroom? And I think part of that has actually been just partnerships with other faculty across campus, so that we're having this sort of like campus-wide, university-wide conversation, so that we don't feel the limitation so much of that 50-minute, 75-minute one-shot session. So one of those goals with our teaching librarians of the group and the community of practice itself is actually teaching librarians the historical context of the marginalized students that are part of this campus, that are a part of our community, and getting librarians to actually challenge their own assumptions and beliefs about those students. So one example is that we talked about some different classroom activities, how we could actually apply some of this and some of the things we're reading about and learning about from other faculty into the classroom. And so that assets-based approach of getting students to talk about what they know how to do and how they do it. So one of those things could be actually the search process. And we talk a little bit about, okay, well, where are you getting information and who are the voices that are being represented? And what does that look like in the scholarly sphere and the scholarly work? So this is an activity that we've developed as a group, as a community, so that we're able to put that into our Writing 200 classes. That is the majority of the classes that we see at the first year writing level.
Mm-hmm. Nice, that's great. So you mentioned, Amy, that there are these different ideas and frameworks that are very flexible, and it's not always easy to know how they translate into practice. And you all have already given some good examples of things you've done in your classes, but I was wondering if you could all expand on some changes that you've made to your teaching or other works to kind of counter deficit thinking. A few of other stuff you've done in the class that's been useful that the participants here might benefit from.
Sure, so I'll just give one last teaching example. It's something that I use and I feel like it applies to pretty much any class that we teach. We can use it in so many different places. I'll often start class by having students either free write or think, pair, share for 5 minutes about a time that they were looking for information for fun. So not because anyone told them to, not for school, not for work, but something that they wanted to learn genuinely about on their own. And I asked them to talk to each other about where they went, what information they chose and why. And then whatever it is I'm doing for the rest of the class, whatever the other learning outcomes are, I'll kind of relate it back to the things that they're already doing in their everyday lives that they picked up on instinctually or from other teaching. And at UNLV, we also collaborate with faculty a lot to design research assignments. And so I'll often ask them and suggest that they put this in as a formal part of the research project, whatever it is they're working on. And outside of teaching, in research, Rosan and I worked with Brittany Paloma-Fiedler and Emily Patney on a strengths-based transfer student research paper. So this is a student population that we focus a lot on their quote-unquote gaps and the things that they're missing because we haven't had them through their entire education. And so we explicitly sought to learn about their unique strengths, and we learned that they're super motivated and they complete their degree. They're super motivated to complete their degree, and they actually have a higher retention rate at UNLV than first-year students. But they do struggle with sense of belonging because they feel like they aren't part of the quote-unquote traditional student body, even though they make up more than 30% of our students. So to me, this speaks to our messaging, right? So what are we doing to give them this impression that they're not a genuine part of our student body when they're 30% of our students? So that's influenced how we've worked on our outreach. We've had 2 transfer student mixers since that project, and we're working on a transfer student workshop series for the fall.
Cool, very cool.
And I would also just like to add, at the university libraries at UNLV, we're really reframing the student employment experience. So I coordinate our peer learning program, which employs students to lead outreach initiatives and co-teach alongside librarians. And a lot of the former language that we used to use to describe peer coach participants would classify them as at risk, when in actuality, these students are not any different than our student employees within the libraries, whom are also often first generation from underrepresented backgrounds and exhibiting financial need. And we don't use those labels to describe or define them. So by having the peer coaches instead identify and build on their strengths, and by focusing on this through things like job training, workshops, one-on-one conversations, we've been able to transform the role that they play within the libraries, and they've made a tremendous impact to our teaching and outreach programs. And I think to counter deficit thinking, it really begins, therefore, with our own mindset and how we frame our work. So with these same students, we're now working on a community-based participatory research project to expand on the transfer student research that Chelsea just mentioned. And one thing that's really unique about the project is that the peer coaches are doing the research, and they're researching the strengths and the lived experiences of first-generation students through the lens of first-generation students themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I really, what I appreciate about that project is working with students instead of predefining or predetermining what is important to them, right? Working together on that. So yeah, that sounds great. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think I really resonate with them about how it's important to think about the sense of belonging of our students. And I think it's also the key of culturally responsive teaching in terms of how we can create a learning environment that student teachers feel both respected and connected to each other. And me personally, in my teaching, when I first started teaching, I actually was very reluctant to tell them me as not a native speaker, but then I realized it's actually important for me to tell them more about my personal story, how I actually also struggled in college, and that really helped my students to feel connected to me, and that really worked well in terms of making myself more available and actually more vulnerable for them to communicate more of their concerns to me. So that's really something that worked out for me in my personal teaching. And in terms of actually working on larger projects, I find it also very helpful to work with faculty, as Eamon also both Rosan and Chelsea said, to understand our students' backgrounds. So by working with those faculty on I'm currently on a curriculum development team for an international student pathway program, and to closely work with those teachers who frequently work with the students, and to bring my personal background, I was able to advocate for integrating the tacit knowledge of those international students to the curriculum development, and also to some of the assignment design, which turned out to be very helpful for both entities to know better how to understand students' backgrounds. And as my current role as the on-instrument design librarian, I also make sure that in all my modules or my design work, I try to explore different ways to add into the different interactive features or different content, different formats of those content, so that students can have different ways to engage with the content. So for example, for one of the modules, my team designed for the distance learners at my college, who are usually considered as untraditional learners, which the word really did not like. They usually have different competing priorities in life. Sometimes they may not have time or the energy to play games of some of the interactive features that maybe some other students might prefer. So it's important to provide different ways that they can engage with the same content, and to think about different preferences that different learners have. That's another thing I incorporate into my design work to make sure that students are provided with different ways to engage with the content.
Nice, yeah. And I really like, one thing I've been noticing among the responses is everyone seems to be kind of bringing that consistent advocacy to different areas of their work, right? To different potential partnerships and different potential allies across campus, right? So within the library and within your colleagues there, but also other departments and people who may be thinking along similar lines for creating assignments, for creating, peer review program, things like that. So that's great to see. Amy, did you have any thoughts on this question?
Just to add really quick and to play off of your point too of kind of this collaboration idea, here at Westchester, our Writing 200 is our research writing class, which is where we see most of the students. And the issue is there's no common syllabus, which is bonkers to me, right? At other institutions I've worked at, there's like a common syllabus. So each faculty member gets to kind of choose their own adventure really for their students. So the collaboration has to be deep. Otherwise, we're not really making any kind of meaningful impact. But something that we've come across like with the writing faculty is that they've noticed this trouble with students really reading academic sources. And so that's something that we're starting to shift our focus to, where it's not just finding the thing, right? It's actually understanding like who's writing it, who's contributing, whose voice is left out, but then also how to read in the language of the academy versus the language of the community. And so that's really playing into this culturally responsive teaching, right? Because we need to be thinking about what is the language that students are thinking in, what is the language students are writing in, and that really affects how they're searching and finding information. So that's something that we're focusing in more so here in collaboration with the writing and rhetoric faculty.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so one last question that I wanted to ask before we move to Q&A with the audience. These are all great ideas, and at the same time, there are just a lot of barriers that may potentially come up while we're trying to pursue work like this. So I was wondering if you all have experienced barriers in accomplishing more culturally relevant or anti-deficit pedagogy, and if so, how did you overcome those barriers that did come up?
I can start answering this question. Just coming back to my answer to the first question about the one-shot session, and I think we do have limitations in of the time we can have with students in our classrooms. That's why I think it's really important to think about not beyond the information literacy education we provide, but to think about the experience we co-create with other stakeholders in our institution. So for example, while it can be very hard for us to give to give one-shot sessions or to those patrons at the reference desk to engage them in ways that other faculty might be able to do in a semester-long or 4-credit courses. We can actively partner with other stakeholders and engage in other activities on campus. So me personally, as the coordinator for Affordable Solutions, I find it very helpful to understand students through some of the events like those textbook cost reduction initiatives, and to also co-organize those cultural events for different groups, and to attend those different opportunities to do outreach for example, our incoming students. So things like that. So I do think it's important to make ourselves available in different venues and really to think creatively about other ways we can engage in the student experience. Another challenge I personally have is sometimes I think we as librarians or educators may think it's important for us to change our mindset. But sometimes I realize it's also the students themselves that may think in a deficit model, that they may feel a lack of sense of belonging, or they feel that they're reluctant to ask questions because they're not sure if it's them or it's because of the environment being different from where they come from. So I do think it's really important to think about how do we give agency to students and to really create an environment that students are encouraged and are willing to voice themselves, to express their concerns, to share with their thinking with us.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a really great point, especially about students also internalizing this deficit thinking, right? So it's a very pervasive ideology and way of thinking that affects all of us. So trying to come up with ways to provide them with more agency and more ways to kind of critically question what they kind of may accept about their status within an institution. I think that's really a great point. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Sure. So when I really think about these barriers, I think they're both internal and external, and that institutional culture can be an especially difficult barrier for us to overcome, as we may not have support to reframe our instruction or our outreach at a higher level, and that this can really hinder the work that we want to do as a department or on an individual basis. And so it can be, for me, it's been useful to start by addressing internal or personal barriers, and by examining and challenging and addressing personally held, deeply rooted bias. I've worked to do this by reading experiences of people in education that are not like me, by paying attention to the assumptions that I have about students and interrogating why I have them. And it's also been fortunate that I've been very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to learn from other student employees who've candidly shared their experiences and have reminded me how things like labels can be very harmful and damaging to them. I think another step is to practice interrupting negative talk about students in both small and big ways, and taking action. So whether it's an assumption that a colleague might be making about a student, for example, that they're lazy or that they don't know how to analyze information properly, or maybe a larger issue within an institution and the culture labeling certain students as inherently at risk. I think instead of solely thinking about how harmful these assumptions are, it's really important to find active ways to disrupt these dialogues and to change the dialogue. And so the last thing that I'd like to emphasize is that whenever possible, it's really important to elevate the role of our student employees and to value their voice and their contributions by creating space and opportunity for them to contribute to our committee work, our research projects, our teaching and learning initiatives. They're really like the alumni of the library, and any way that we can make a big impact and elevate their role, I think is going to make a tremendous impact on our campus as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up a great point too, is with the negative talk about students and student shaming. It's a really excellent example of how that deficit thinking plays out without us realizing it, right? Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Just to follow up with Roseanne and what you said, just a little thing here. That first point of identifying and dismantling your own bias is really a good first step and potential barrier, you know, and being able to bring faculty in that are interested in these topics and these ideas to actually kind of forge that change in your department. At my institution, it's a union environment, so there are, when something is not explicitly on somebody's statement of expectations here, sometimes they're reluctant to actually go to a talk or to join in a department way. So this community of practice is actually awesome because we've had such a great success bringing in speakers and bringing faculty who are volunteering, which is actually a big step in our cultural change here. And I think it's important that we're not just looking at ourselves and our librarians here, but that we're actually making a path towards dealing with systemic barriers across campus for students. And it's important to know that we're not alone in those initiatives. So as the student success librarian, I sort of have a buzzword type of title, which gets me on all kinds of high-level academic committees. And there are other people who are, you know, into student success initiatives, and a lot of that is actually dismantling some of these barriers and rethinking how we're classifying students as at risk, which is problematic, as everybody else mentioned. So we're not alone in this. We don't necessarily have to just stay in the library with this and dismantling those barriers, but definitely collaborating across campus, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's great. And I think, yeah, starting with ourselves is a great, great idea, a great place to begin. But one thing I've also been wondering about lately is kind of the limits of acknowledging our own personal bias and our own mindsets and things like that. But that's just something I've thought about without any answers to. So I'd like to turn it over to questions. So please If you all have any questions for the panelists, you can type them in the chat box, or you can submit them on Twitter with the InfoLit_not_deficit hashtag. And in the meantime, a couple people mentioned, Rosanna and Chelsea, that they're interested in hearing a little more on the kind of peer mentoring program that you have in place. If you want to expand on that a bit, and then I'll relay a question over to y'all.
Sure. So we have within the libraries about 130 student employees that work in all of our service points and traditional areas within the library. And we have an endowed program called the Mason Undergraduate Peer Research Coach Program, which employs 7 undergraduate students from their first year through graduation with the goal to support them with additional opportunities to be engaged in the work of the library to ensure that they graduate, as well as contribute to all of our efforts to contribute to student learning. And the major ways that they do that is through co-curricular outreach efforts. They represent the library at all of our campus events and our internal library events for students. And then they co-teach alongside librarians, primarily in the English 102, our first year composition library sessions, where we see anywhere from 70 to 90 sections a semester. And they're involved in the lesson plan from start to finish. They present information in the classroom. They assist students while they're navigating on their searches for their topics, and help throughout the entire session. They also contribute to our K-12 instruction. So like this week, for example, we have some students in from Upward Bound, and also we're going to have a high school visit coming in. They're going to be doing some prototyping with our new makerspace. So they contribute to student learning in a lot of different ways. And I think the main thing is that we value their contributions and their expertise as students, and really want their voice to be heard and contributed to the work that we do. But I'm happy to answer other questions about it.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So it looks like we have a question from Veronica for Amy and Rosanna. What kinds of activities have you done with colleagues in the library to not only identify assumptions and biases, but also actively disrupt them? So if you have any ideas for activities or practices with colleagues. And I guess if anyone else has ideas, chime in as well. Yeah.
Really, most of the activities we do in the community of practice group is we're doing readings, which isn't that exciting, right? We're doing readings and like discussing it and actually giving ourselves space to talk about these things and instruction, because I feel like we just don't have that much time. A lot of, I don't know about you guys, but I'm teaching like 50 information literacy sessions a semester, which is a lot. And so, if we're able to just get in a room and read an article together and talk about it, that's one way and one activity that we've done.
I don't lead these activities, but we have a group of colleagues on an inclusion and equity committee that have done similar things, where they've led discussions where we've done readings and articles, but they've also been curating a list of educational webinars or discussions that are happening nationally and sharing them and encouraging dialogue around those. So in addition to just viewing one of those sessions, there's accompanying discussions that either before or after the session where people have been having, I think, more transparent and vulnerable conversations around some of these topics and doing this work. So I've been working to engage in those spaces when possible. I think also just doing this kind of work, sharing our research and sharing some of the pedagogies that we're applying into our teaching and learning practices at department meetings and in national spaces also then trickles back to the library. But I definitely think it's something we could be doing more of and making an active effort towards doing.
Yeah, I like that idea of going to a webinar, for example, and then chatting about it afterwards, right? Because that provides some really good fodder for discussion and time for reflection, things like that, that otherwise might not exist. So making that time as it occurs. Question from Danielle regarding the teaching example in IO classes, having students search for fun and seeking something related to their everyday life. Even if we collaborate with faculty, how much time can you spend addressing individual students' research questions? So it sounds like kind of a question about how to make use of that limited time and kind of accommodate students' different perspectives within that one-shot session. If I'm interpreting your question right, Daniel. So yeah, anything that's worked in terms of teaching strategy. Yeah, Chelsea.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is referencing exactly what I was talking about before, but if it was, that's honestly only about 5 minutes of class. So, okay. So it's kind of a good starting point, I feel like, where students aren't necessarily going to be searching about that right then in class. We're not going to spend all of class focusing on something that they're learning for fun, but having them reflect on something that they've looked into before. Like, I mean, we've all ended up in like Wikipedia rabbit holes, right? Like our students do also. So what is it that they're learning about outside of the classroom, and asking them to reflect on that and kind of thinking about the strategies that they're using, and then applying them to the academic context. So we do still spend most of the time talking about their research assignment and whatever learning outcomes we might have for that class. But we started off by kind of reminding them, like, hey, you do this all the time. Like, you're a person, you have interests, you go out and you go learn about those interests. So it's really only about 5 minutes of class.
Yeah, one thing that I've done, just to interject, is kind of instead of thinking about the class in terms of like, you know, having the normal information literacy instruction, normal quote unquote, and you know, I databases and searching and like the mechanics of the library, and then like another part of the class that's different, just having those, you know, reframing the whole session to reflect like what I would want students to get out of it, what I think is most important and want to prioritize in that 50 minutes. So just kind of starting from scratch in a sense, and then building up from there, if that makes sense. Other thoughts?
Yeah, so me personally, I actually learned this from another more experienced librarian, which is very helpful for me to incorporate into my sessions. So I actually start most of my sessions with like a quick poll for all students, like an anonymous poll for them to answer questions like, what is your biggest concern? What is your biggest question for this assignment? What is your research topic? What are you passionate about researching? So using this kind of anonymous poll and show it up on the screen actually saves a lot of time in terms of me asking around what they think or what they struggle with or what they are interested in researching. And after I collected those responses from the students, I usually notice, like usually there are only like some very common questions within there. And in terms of the research questions, I make sure to databases, or when I teach them about other search strategies, I incorporate the examples that they gave me in the beginning. So that way I can both like save time in terms of asking all of their different thoughts, and also try to incorporate their different preferences and give specific examples to address their diverse needs as they specify in their anonymous poll. So I really have, it really works for me to use this like a poll in the beginning and to collect more of their feedback and to inform my teaching, to adjust my teaching.
Yeah, I like that, starting out with student feedback and getting their input early on in the session. Absolutely, yeah. Great. It looks like we have a question for Chelsea from Brenda. Interested in what sorts of topics you're doing for the transfer population? Yeah.
Yes, so this is definitely super under construction, like it's like pre-construction. I think it's definitely a post-ALA project, to be honest. But what we'll probably do is go back through the data that we collected through the interviews and through the surveys and see the things that students mentioned struggling with. But I honestly think a lot of it will end up being relatively general. So it's going to be things that they can drop in that are like general information literacy needs that they can kind of pick like, oh, I do know how to evaluate a source, but I don't know how to search in a subject-specific database, right? So they can kind of like drop in on the things that they need and they are aware that they're like lacking in, right? So instead of us kind of saying like, these are all of the things that transfer students all need, we kind of expect there to be a totally different group at every single one, because it's just gonna, every individual experience is so different. So yeah, sorry, not a real answer, but definitely still under construction. Roseanne, do you have anything else you want to add about that?
I'm just going to add that one of the things that we learned is that, yes, we tried and they didn't come. That one of the things we learned is that not all students are going to come to events, especially transfer students, but we're attempting to really attract all transfer students in all the different ways that they want to learn about services and resources and to get to know the library. So we have a transfer student mixer for some of the students that want the on-campus engagement and as a way to develop that sense of belonging. We're hoping that the workshop series will really support the students that want the in-person interaction and the help in person. And then as a way to support students that many students told us that they want to receive email communication. So we're going to also do email communication as a way to tie in these same topics and time them appropriate with the semester. So at the start of the semester, the message is going to be different than what they're going to get at something mid-semester or late in the semester. So I think it's the thing that we're learning is like you have to do a lot of different things because transfer students are in a lot of different places. And if you have a transfer student office, I think coordinating with that is a really great opportunity and an idea. We in particular only have admissions coordinators that work directly with our transfer students. And so there's a team of people that are kind of working in a subgroup related to transfer student outreach, but there's not a formal office that services them and supports them, which is unfortunate for us.
Right, are there any other questions for our panelists on what they've discussed? Okay. Looks like there's a question about transfer students on social media, whether you incorporate social media into your strategies. Yes.
We do, but also we're cognizant that of the 1,000 Instagram followers we have, there's, it's a small subset. I'm not sure how many of them are transfer students, but I do think that like using even just digital signs or, your especially your website where students are seeing that is a better place where you're going to more likely see a touch to transfer students in that space.
And then there's a question from Kimberly about students needing to read and understand scholarly journal articles and adjusting to a different kind of reading. So different ways to frame this. It's not in a deficit-focused way. And this is something actually I've been wondering a lot about too, about kind of adjusting to that culture and those expectations of academe that can be extremely unfamiliar for many of our students. So,
yeah, Kimberly, thank you too for calling me out. I think I might have said some deficit language there when I was talking about that too. I think something we were noticing is that we wanted to be able to allow students the space to make mistakes in their writing. So this came out of sort of like the writing pedagogy focus, right? There was a lot of negative talk about, well, like students just can't write and they're just copying and pasting journal article quotes into their papers. And so it came out of sort of this negative talk, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard before, right? So something that we were trying to focus on in our work with the writing program was more like, okay, so a lot of people are complaining about student writing, but I think one way that we framed it to be more positive, right, and this less deficit thinking framework was thinking of it more like, okay, well, the research shows that actually thinking is hard, and when you're thinking hard, you make more mistakes in your writing. So if we were able to frame that to our writing faculty and to our librarians too, who were sort of helping with this research piece, we were able to get more of a buy-in from the faculty on approaching it as, okay, well, how can we let students, make mistakes where they're able to kind of learn the language of the academy and your expectations. And so I don't know, I think that was one way that we were able to take sort of that negative talk and to push back on that and say, hey, thinking is hard and students are making mistakes because they're thinking hard and they're thinking in whatever language of their community. And so it comes off in the writing that way. So I think that was one way we sort of moved that around, right? Bringing out the research and talking about how that works and allowing students to use their language.
Yeah, and that makes me think of a meeting that we had here at my work a month or two ago with a group of our instruction librarians who all participate in the kind of first year writing seminar instruction, right? And it's clear that there are some librarians who felt very strongly that students were unprepared, they were unfamiliar with library resources, with everything, writing, you know, doing research papers, and others in our group who felt strongly that that was what we're here for. We're here to help them with that transition. So it's interesting to see how those dynamics play out in a group setting with not necessarily deficit thinking, but just those different understandings of what students need and our role in that as well, right? Yeah. All right. So I think we can wrap up our session. I don't know if there are any final words from Lauren, but thank you all again for being here, and just a round of virtual applause for our panelists. And I'll turn it over to Lauren. Thank you all again.
Well, I want to say thank you to all the panelists. You gave us a lot of good ideas and insight into how we should be avoiding deficit thinking. So I really appreciate your comments today. I know the session is being recorded, so it will be sent out, I believe, to all the registrants. And then also please be expecting a evaluation form to come along with that. So I appreciate everybody again for being here today, and hope your summers are all going well.
Bye, thank you.